Not since Fidel Castro took power more than 60 years ago have so many people fled Cuba as they did last year. Almost 250,000 people have left as shortages of everything from food to energy added to what were already difficult circumstances for many. With us now on the state of that country, known firsthand by many a Canadian tourist, let's welcome in Miami, Florida, Sebastian Arcos, Associate Director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University, and in Kingston, Ontario, Karen Dubinsky, Professor of History at Queen's University and author of Cuba Beyond the Beach, Stories of Life in Havana. And we welcome both of you to TVO tonight. Let's just start by getting a little background on the record here. And I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, if he would, to bring this graphic up. Canadians know Cuba very well. More than 220,000 Cubans, amounting to 2% of the island's entire population, were taken into custody after crossing the U.S.-Mexico border last year. The figure is higher than during the biggest Cuban migration waves in the 80s and 90s combined. Before the pandemic, the biggest source of tourist money for the Cuban regime was, yes, Canadians. About 1.3 million Canadians would enter and leave Cuba in a typical year, more than any other nationality, including Cubans themselves. And Canadians accounted for more than half of all tourists entering Cuba at the start of 2023. Sebastian, why don't we start with this? Why are so many people leaving right now?
Because Cuba is undergoing the worst crisis since 1959. And it's not just an economic crisis, it's a deep crisis of political legitimacy for the regime. People don't believe what the regime says. They don't believe there is any prospects of economic or political improvement in Cuba. They are desperate to leave a situation that they feel have only a downward trend and there is no chances for improvement.
And a quick follow-up here. Demographically speaking, do you know who is leaving Cuba?
Yes, there is a recent paper published in January by Columbia University that argues 80% of those leaving are between the ages of 16 and 59, which is well within the labor force in Cuba.
So that's the future, in fact, leaving. That's really problematic. Okay. Karen, take us back almost 2 years, if you would. July 11, 2021, thousands of Cubans took to the streets to protest in numbers not seen in many decades. What were they protesting?
They were protesting some of the same things, some of what Sebastian has already outlined. They were protesting the economic collapse suffered by many countries in that part of the world during the pandemic. Cuba is a tourist economy. There were no tourists for a long time. So yes, there were and continue to be incredible economic challenges. I think what I hear from Cuban friends and colleagues is that they were also protesting the word I keep hearing was a sense of abandonment by their government, a sense that the government that's in power today was not doing enough to address those economic issues, and instead was embarking on a new campaign, not a new campaign, but a renewed campaign of censorship, of basically shooting the messenger. And I think the response by the Cuban government to those protests, which was very harsh, which ended up with many people, hundreds of people in jail, many of them very young, caused that gap between people's sense of what the government could accomplish and what they were actually doing. That gap has just grown wider.
Sebastian, we know that many Cubans are leaving for the United States, but beyond America, what other countries are they fleeing to?
There are Cubans everywhere, pretty much. But I think besides the United States, Spain is taking the largest number. There is a governmental program in Spain to adopt Cubans who can prove descendants from Spanish parents or grandparents or ancestors. And of course, many Cubans can prove that. And my understanding from the news of independent reporters in Cuba, the Spanish embassy facilities processing people cannot keep up with the number of requests they are getting of people who wants to move to Spain.
And in terms of people coming to America, how has the Biden administration, in your view, reacted to that development?
Well, I believe it took them way too long to realize that at least one part of the problem was the Biden open border policy that allowed Cuba and Nicaragua to use that to then push hundreds of thousands of Nicaraguans, Cubans, and Venezuelans through the U.S. border into the United States. I think the policy has changed, and it needs to be very clear that Cubans wanting to join their relatives in the United States must do so through a legal process that already was opened in the U.S. Embassy in Havana.
Let me follow up with Karen on the issue of Nicaragua, because in November of 2021, Nicaragua announced that it had dropped visa requirements for Cuban citizens. I guess the given explanation was to promote tourism. I think someone from Nicaragua's Tourism Bureau said at the time, they are lovers of our volcanoes. They don't have any volcanoes, so they love ours. How much opportunism do you think there is on the part of Nicaraguan and Cuban governments related to that?
That volcano comment, was it off the cuff? Was it deliberate? It was certainly in poor taste, but Cubans, as in my experience, they're always really good at making fun of the absurdities of life, and the number of volcano sightseeing memes that sprouted up in the internet, in social media as a result of that comment. It's completely cynical. Is migration desperation a business? All over the world, migration desperation is monetized. I think that's obviously unfortunate in Cuba. It's no less unfortunate in other parts of the world. And it shouldn't also blind us, the politics of it and the finances of it shouldn't blind us to the incredible human toll that migration takes, that undocumented migration takes, any migration. But these are dangerous things that people are doing.
Sebastian, you wanted to add?
Yes, this was even more than just an opportunistic chance taken by both governments. This was engineered by Havana with the help of Nicaragua. They are allies, of course. They have a common enemy, the United States. So they used this opportunity to create a bridge, an air bridge between Havana and Managua that would facilitate Cubans to just walk to the border. This is the fourth time in 60 years that the Cuban government has used engineered migration waves to force the United States to the negotiating table, and it worked. Last year, the Biden administration made a number of concessions to the Cuban government, things that they wanted. They had requested more visas, they had requested more remittances, they had requested more American tourists, and unfortunately, the U.S. government gave them all three in May of last year.
And Sebastian, a quick follow-up. When Cubans try to flee Cuba for Nicaragua or the United States, in your view, how well treated are they when they get to that new country?
You mean to the United States?
Yes, or Nicaragua.
Well, Nicaragua is just a transit. There is a sort of a line of mafia groups that help move Cubans from one country to the next, all the way to the U.S. border, each of them charging their respective amount. The price for a Cuban person to travel from Nicaragua, or let's say from Havana all the way to the U.S. border, is somewhere between $10,000 and $12,000, depending on the case. Once they get to the United States, they are usually admitted, as Cubans have been for over 50 years, into the United States. And I can tell you that most of those 300,000, and that's the updated number that we got just in January, 334,000 entered the United States between October of 2029 and December of 2022. most of them, they end up here in South Florida, which, by the way, is very flat, no volcanoes. But the Cubans argue that they go to Nicaragua to see the volcanoes in Hialeah.
Hialeah, which is Florida. Okay, understood. Let me ask you about the move by the Nicaraguan government, which has apparently seen a rise in charter airlines offering exorbitantly high prices for flights out of Cuba. What's the story there?
The story is essentially a collusion between two authoritarian regimes that are using engineered flows of migration not only to affect their common enemy, the United States, but also to make a buck. They are actually making money out of the suffering of people fleeing both the authoritarian regimes in Cuba and in Nicaragua. And also keep in mind the following. The Cuban regime depends almost entirely of inflows of hard currency because the Cuban economy is a disaster and doesn't produce anything. One of those most important inflows is that of remittances for Cuban Americans in Miami. This is another way that the Cuban regime has to absorb those dollars coming from Miami into the government financial system and away from Cubans who are supposed to receive those dollars. Keep in mind, Cubans do not receive those dollars in cash. They get them on a plastic card that they can use eventually to buy the products that they want. But there is an exchange rate that essentially robs Cubans of about half of the value of the money their relatives sends from Miami to Cuba.
Karen, we're told that Cuban pro-democracy activists are appealing to Canadians not to travel to Cuba. So give us some advice on that. What do you think we should do?
That's a really big one. I know I'm not Cuban, right? I'm not Cuban. I'm a Canadian who researches Cuba. I'm a Canadian who has, for many years, brought Canadian students to take courses in Cuba, in Cuban culture. I think that the necessity of this migration wave, as I keep saying, is something that's incredibly sad and incredibly, ultimately, really harmful for the entire country. Is it going to help the country to stop tourism? Who is a tourist boycott going to hurt? Well, it's going to hurt the people, the many people who make their living from tourism, whether in in large-scale hotels or as private entrepreneurs, small entrepreneurs who rent out a bit of their house, or they rented a bit of their house for accommodation. They rented a bit of the house for restaurants, etc. So I don't think a tourism boycott is the answer for Canada by any means. I don't think I'm looking forward to taking my students again in May under incredibly difficult conditions, not difficult for us as visitors, but we understand the university professors and artists and painters, all the musicians, the people with whom we have learned for so many years, they are in really, really desperate straits. And I don't see how us not going is going to help them. Those kind of boycotts always hurt the little people. There had been this spirit of increasing entrepreneurship in Cuba during the Obama era that was snuffed out by what Trump, the kinds of activities Trump embarked on. Those entrepreneurs have been appealing to various levels of U.S. government to keep the door open for increased travel, increased relationships, because it's through relationships that you make change. And Canada has a good long history of people-to-people relationships with Cuba that I don't think we should see, that I don't think we should stop.
Sebastian, let me get your take on whether Canadians should boycott traveling in Cuba.
Let's see, for Cubans, this is the way they see it. The Cuban government owns a monopoly on the tourist industry in Cuba. They own a monopoly on imports and exports. They own a monopoly on all financial transactions going in and out of the island. For them, any tourist, Canadian or otherwise, visiting the island is similar to Western tourists going to to a safari in South Africa during the apartheid years. This is the way they see it. Tourism doesn't help average Cubans. They help the Cuban government that owns the entire tourist operation. The entrepreneur class that was developed between 2011 and 2016 was squashed by the Cuban government, who felt threatened by the number of Cubans that were actually contributing to the Cuban economy beyond what the government contributes. Keep in mind that over 60 years, the Cuban government, every time it's faced with a situation where he needs to choose between the welfare of the Cuban nation and absolute control, they inevitably always choose control. That is the circumstance. That's what I would support, sort of a less tourist travel, less foreign investment to Cuba, because they are only helping to sustain the regime that is the cause of the suffering and exodus of the Cuban people.
Karen, I have to ask you that directly. By taking your students down to Cuba, do you feel you are in some way supporting the regime that's been in place for more than 6 decades?
Quite the reverse. In fact, it's not true that the state owns the entire tourist economy. I know I can give you many examples of people private entrepreneurs who rent out their houses. Do they pay taxes? Of course they do. So does anybody in the tourist industry in any part of the world. No, I don't think. I want to listen to. I'm listening to Cubans. I'm not listening to myself. As I said, I'm not Cuban. I'm listening to my colleagues in Cuba with whom I've worked. I'm listening to my friends with whom I have, who I've come to know through my research and my work there. Is Cuba a polarized place? Of course, it's a polarized place. Are there people who support the regime still? Of course, there are. Are there others who are more concerned with just getting by, making money, getting a better future for their kids, surviving this period, whatever that's going to look like, availing themselves of the things that continue to exist in that country, such as medical benefits, education benefits? Those are the people that I'm interested in, and those are the people who we listen to. Those are the people who have been teaching us through this course for many years. Many of them have left as well, and so I'm certainly not being naive or dismissive of the desperate situation people are in, and those with the opportunity, like many of the musicians that we work with, have left. Of course they have the means to. It's a really bad situation. What's our individual responsibility to make it better? I think to continue the people-to-people kinds of projects.
Okay, let me put that to Sebastian then.
Or other things.
Let me put that to Sebastian then. Sebastian, are you at all concerned that if many Canadians, who are, as we pointed out earlier, a huge chunk of tourism in Cuba, if we stop going down there, that ordinary Cubans will suffer as a result?
No, I am not concerned. As I explained before, those average Cubans that we are concerned about do not have a stake in the major, most lucrative areas of the Cuban economy. Only the state does. The state controls every hotel chain in the country, every airline, every bank, every store where decent food can be bought is controlled by the state. There is really no chance for Cubans to make a living in that country. And that explains why 3.5% of the population has left Cuba in the last year and a half. I think it's a little naive to expect that tourists traveling to a totalitarian society will be able to affect any significant change in that society. And the best example is Canadians, who have been doing this for 30 years, and we have not seen any significant, substantial change in the Cuban regime in those 30 years.
Okay, let me follow up with you on this, Sebastian, and that is the impact all this will have on American politics. And, we have to go back, I guess, 4+ decades to remember when the Marielitos exodus from Cuba turned into a major political nightmare for then President Jimmy Carter. and it was one of the reasons he had trouble getting reelected in 1980 and, in fact, lost that election to Ronald Reagan. Should Joe Biden be similarly concerned, in your view, about what this current exodus could do to his political prospects, not just in Florida, but across the southern United States?
The administration is very concerned, and it has reasons to be concerned. We at FIU do a poll among Cuban Americans every other year. We have been doing it for 30 years. We have a significant track of Cuban American opinions about U.S.-Cuba policy and about, of course, domestic policies here in the United States. The President Obama got a significant support from Cuban Americans in 14, 15, 16, because they were hopeful that a change in U.S. policy will finally open up and begin to dissolve the power of the Cuban state. That turned into a massive disappointment when the Cuban government basically retrenched it and didn't use the opportunity given by President Obama. What we see now in the poll is that a vast majority of Cuban Americans are turning towards the Republican Party. Now, there's a tradition of support among Cuban Americans for the Republican Party, but that support has been coming down for the last 20 years, all the way to 2018. Since then, we have been seeing a revival of that conservatism. And in the last election last year, Cuban Americans voted for the Republican candidates at a rate of about 75%. So yes, they should be concerned.
In our last minute here, Karen, do you want to give us your read on the political impact of all of this?
I'm still thinking about the tourism issue. You know, there's lots of Canadians go to Florida, right? Lots of Canadians go to Florida. Florida is now in the grips of a government that censors at the education system, that refuses to teach African-American history, and that is homophobic beyond belief. What I advocate, those are two issues that I think are hugely important human rights issues. What I advocate that Canadians don't go to Florida, boycott Florida, because of those issues, because of the rampant racism and homophobia being preached by the Florida government? No, I would say the same thing. Go and talk to people. Establish the kind of people-to-people ties that Canada has had with Cuba and Florida in the past. And I think those are better these days. Those are better ways of pushing change than state-to-state policies. State-to-state policies hurt people.
And just in our last few seconds, are you intending to take Queen students back down to Cuba when?
We're going in May.
You're going in May. And what's the mission of the program?
Yeah, it's a course called Cuban Culture and Society. After all of this, I can tell you, we're not avoiding the politics. It's impossible to avoid the politics, but our focus has always been on the cultural achievements of the place. We go to, we listen to musicians, not just making music, but playing, but speaking as well. We're very interested in the Cuban arts world, and so our mission is to listen to what Cubans want to tell us in terms of cultural achievements.
Understood. I want to thank both of you for coming on to TVO tonight and sharing your views. Sebastian Arcos from Florida International University, Karen Dubinsky from Queen's University. Buenas noches. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.